Hi everybody, Mark from Audio Pursuit. And in this episode I want to talk to you about my 5 favorite vintage receivers. Now these are all units that I experienced firsthand, but by no means should they be considered all the great receivers that came out during the 60s and 70s and 80s. Just the ones that came by way of my personal experience. So let's get started. Number 5, the Kyocera R851. Now I'm going to say this flat out. I think this was the best looking receiver made during the 1980s. It still had that classic wood sides, but instead of a shiny aluminum brushed metal front face, they went with a darker gunmetal and really set itself apart, very distinct. And then with their Kyocera logo, they start off with just a white logo, but with later production runs they changed it to a red, and personally I thought the red looked sharper, but that doesn't make up how a receiver performs. And the Kyocera performed really well. It used MOSFET drivers that did get a little warm, but at the same time, man, could they deliver the sound. It was, best way to describe it, just warm with just enough power behind it so that you knew it could handle the speakers of its time. And back in that time period, Boston Acoustics were really popular, JBL, Cerwin-Vega, Polka Audio, ADS. The brands that were out there at the time that a lot of people looked to, Ohm Walsh, so forth, they really did sound good. Now the other interesting thing is the front faceplate. This was a digital tuner, so it had the digital display. But unlike the other receivers of the 1980s that went full space shuttle cockpit with 10,000 lights, buttons, and so forth, no. The R851 was really understated. It had just your input selectors and then a sliding volume control. But down at the bottom behind a panel, if you pushed it open, it dropped down. That was where your tone controls, your tape in and outs, that sort of thing were located. And most of the time people just kept it closed, and it looked fabulous. Really a stunning piece of gear. I can remember having in my own place. My receiver, unfortunately, had an accident due to a slightly inebriated friend who came over one night, so it had to go in the shop, spend about 7 weeks there. And just by chance, the shop owner had an R851 on hand, and he said, "Here, use this." And so I did, and really, very worthy of my time with my Polk Model 10s. I was really happy. I probably would have made him an offer on it, except for 2 things. One, I was just a poor substitute teacher, also working in a retail location, which, funny enough, sold the Pioneer wood sides. And looking back, I looked at some of those models and thought, no, I like this other stuff better. But that was just too wide for the cabinet my grandfather had built. So when my receiver came back, I turned it back in. But fond memories. The Kyocera R851, sneaky good, and one of the receivers out there from the 80s that you can get at a decent price. Number 4, the Marantz 2230B. Now, if you grew up in Denver like I did during the 1970s, you knew every Sunday on the back of the weekly TV guide that was printed out, that was part of the big newspaper. It's a little smaller size, about the size of a comic book. On the back side of it, a company called Soundtrack that became quite big along the Front Range of Colorado. It had an ad. And down at the bottom of that ad, every week, they advertised and they said it, the Marantz 2230B, the king. What they mean by that? They sold a bucket load of them, and they performed extremely well. They only had like 25, maybe 30 watts, but those were real watts back when it mattered. Unlike, the big box receivers nowadays, where a lot of them just, we all know that story. Let's not go down that road. But this unit had it all. It had that classic Marantz sound, that warm undertone, very smooth across the frequency spectrum. The knobs were very consistent and heavy feeling. And then that pinwheel dial for tuning that you just spun with your thumb that had that rubber trackpad on it. I was addicted by it. Now, I never owned one. But in this case, I'm going to qualify myself a bit. That I actually had a roommate down the hall from me who had one, and he was also a stereo nut. So we spent a lot of time listening to music on each other's systems and really got to know each other's gear extremely well for a full year. So I had a lot of seat time with that 2230B, and it was exceptional. There's a reason why Marantz gear, those 70s receivers into the 80s, are still enormously popular and very expensive nowadays on the used market. They just sound good. My number 3, the Harman Kardon 730. This unit was gifted to me back in 2016, and just out of surprise. And I was just so excited to see it. I had had the Harman Kardon Citation 12 amp for a little while, but back in the late 80s, but it needed some repairs, so I had to move off it because I just didn't have the money for it, and somebody else was excited to do it. But the 730 really rocked my world. Out of all those vintage receivers, that probably had the best sheer power per watt that you can imagine. I mean, it was just insanely powerful. Even at that low edge, it could drive far more difficult speakers. And while I had it for a while, it was just, you listen to it, much like the Marantz, has slightly warmer tone. I wouldn't say as warm as the Marantz by any means, but really very nice. The mid-range was silky smooth. Just gorgeous. Nora Jones just sounded terrific on them. And I paired them up with quite a variety of speakers. I had the Pin Audio Senyas around about that time, and so they sound really good. The Totems I had in, just tremendous with them. That slightly warmness worked very well with them. I even tried them out with my Magnepan 1.6s. Now, granted, not a good match there. Really couldn't drive them, but the mids and highs were very nice. But interestingly enough, if you go on YouTube and you search classic receivers, there's one gentleman out there who did a really good video. Sorry, I can't remember who you are by name right now, but he ranked the 730 as his favorite receiver as a repair and reseller because of its quality of parts, easy to repair, and what it offered. So the Harman Kardon 730, I miss you. I had to sell it when I was downsizing. My wife and I were moving, and I had to let it go. And just at that time, a couple of the capacitors started leaking, and I just couldn't wait a couple of months to go to my dedicated repair guy to have it done. So I sold it off, and somebody got a steal because the price on them have skyrocketed, and there's a good reason for it. So that's my number 3. Number 2, the Yamaha R700. Now, background on the R700 with me is that when I was buying my first truly higher quality piece of gear, I was going between that and my number 1 model. And I spent months going back and forth to this little audio shop that had about 3 or 4 locations along the Front Range of Denver, listening to it, driving the poor store manager nuts because I couldn't make up my mind. Yamaha has that tagline of natural sound, and they really mean it. You know, what comes out of their receivers from that time period, and from what I understand again now with their new incredible integrated that just came on the market, is just a very appropriate, non-boosted sound across the spectrum. So it wasn't warm like the Marantz or that Harman Kardon 730 I just mentioned, but it wasn't dry either. Just very nice, consistent sound. The switches on it, you know, they had a vertical knob or rectangular knob, and you turn that, and it felt heavy and solid as you did your selectors. The tuner, very solid, because those were the days when a lot of us listened to radio. And I did a lot of listening to the great station out Boulder, KVCO. Just, you know, the tuner worked really, really well, even pulling in more distant or weaker stations. The other thing about it is that I got a chance to experience it because another guy in the dorms had that receiver. And I believe he had his hooked up to some Boston acoustics. And so, you know, spent some time in his room as well. You know, just kind of wondering, did I make the right decision? But yes, in the end, I felt I made the right decision for me and the receiver I chose. But the R700 by Yamaha, really a quality piece of gear at 50 watts per channel, I believe. To this day, hook that up with the Finchy set of speakers, the Klipsch Heresies, like I said, Boston Acoustics, JBLs, you won't be disappointed. Number 1. This is the receiver that got me through college and for a few years afterwards until I got into separates. And that is the Harman Kardon 680i. Now, I ended up settling on the Harman Kardon because I liked the ultra wideband response. I learned everything I could about that. I geeked out on the specifications. I knew them inside and out. Their low negative feedback that they talked about. All of those items, I just went to town on it. Also, it fit into the solid oak stereo cabinet my grandfather built. So, you know, I just liked everything about it. Well, I worked over at Christmas at a retail store, saved my entire 3 paychecks to buy this. And I was ready to go, and then all of a sudden I looked in the back, I think it was Stereo Review or High Fidelity, and they had an ad for, I think, the New York Audio Exchange, something like that. And they were selling it for $430, and it was listed around Denver at $600. Well, talked to my father, he says, yeah, they look pretty reputable. Give them a call, find out. So I talked to him online, sent him the certified check, and I got my 680i. And I was never disappointed. It had a really fine phono section for the time period. And I did a lot of taping on cassettes and so forth. The tuner was outstanding. In later years, I lived up in Cheyenne, Wyoming for a year. That's 100 miles from Denver, about 95 miles from Boulder. I was able, with that receiver and a Turk antenna in a basement apartment, I was able to pick up KBCO out of Boulder in stereo with 4 out of 5 signal dots, I think it was. Just amazing quality tuner. Second only to the Carver TX2 that I had a chance to play around with for a little while at one point. The switches, the record outs and so forth were very clean. I mean, if you had a tape playing and then you had that selected, the tuner would still be on, but you would not hear the tuner at all, bleeding through in between songs. That good circuitry was involved. I also used it as my amplifier with my Polk Monitor 10Bs to run a dance for a few hundred people on the campus of Colorado State University. And we did really well that night. So this receiver took a lot of beatings. And then I got into separates. And so sold that off to a friend. I don't know what ended up happening to it, but about 10 years ago I felt a bit nostalgic, and so I found one online, and interestingly enough, its serial number was just 3 off of my original. So that's my story about the HK680i. Main thing is great sound, slightly warm, just like the 730. Really clean response range, an outstanding tuner, great record out capability, and really able to drive speakers without getting hot. So please like and subscribe to my channel. I'm going to be doing more of these. I do have some reviews set up. I got one coming up next week. But until then, enjoy some music and take care.